We've been talking to a number of experts about what's going on in the industry, and the big thing that happened, I guess, over the last year is that essentially 6 companies have become 60% of the market capitalization of the entire United States stock market, and obviously have dominant control in the space. And there's been a call out, I think, across the industry for regulation of the OTTs. And I mean, what are you seeing this as something that's going to happen similar to what happened in New Zealand, for example, when they separated the telco into 2 parts, or deregulation in the United States in the 80s with MCI and AT&T? Do you think we have something like that coming in our direction, or do you think we're sort of just going to see more of the same, and there's a new paradigm between government regulators and sort of infrastructure providers?
Well, Bill, it's a long time since the OTTs were young upstarts, a bit like you and me, maybe, you know. So yeah, for sure they're attracting a huge amount of attention, not just in the States, of course. I mean, I think Europe is, the EU is particularly strong in some of the issues here. Ireland with Facebook recently, and I think it's inevitable that there will be more regulation, and the people who manage that best will be the people who recognize it is coming and prepare for it. And if you think about, what's the accommodation between our business and our business objectives and the public objectives? And there's very legitimate public objectives on privacy, on the use of data, on safety of citizens and so forth, So, and you see the big guys preparing for this in all sorts of ways. And then, I mean, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, Nick Clegg, is the head of public relations and regulation for Facebook worldwide. So they're obviously going to the politicians, to heavyweight politicians, to learn and to think about what's coming, and it's inevitable, absolutely inevitable.
I think we've, as an industry, danced around the edges, and I'll be very candid and blunt right now, somewhat unsuccessfully with trying to regulate OTT. Yes, we've tried to use competition law, we've tried to use consumer law, God only knows how many times we've tried to dust off net neutrality, we've tried to do privacy data protection, but I'd say by and large, when you look at those 4 or 5 elements, those tools, if you will, that regulators have used, they've pretty much just kept things at bay, but they haven't solved the problem. I do think you need a regulator, given the fact that, yes, you can have somebody in there who can manipulate a market potentially to its own advantage. It's how that, what I'll call common good, could be served. And we're not trying to destroy anybody's business model. There will be a transaction, just like we had access charges in the United States and around the world in the 80s and in the 90s. Those access charges will be worked out. So hopefully they're fair. Unfortunately, they probably will have to be regulated, because you need that neutral party in there to say, I'm the proxy competitor, I'm on the outside, and I think those charges are good. Or I don't think those charges are fair, and I think you ought to adjust them in a particular way. Once it's working fine, then the regulator ought to get out.
No, we're in an interesting place. So just on the antitrust, many people say that the EU will be the folks that step in. You probably remember back in the 90s when Sprint was being acquired by MCI, and it was the Europeans that actually, in the end, I think, slowed everything down and eventually blew the deal up, right? And many people think that it'll be Europe that will step in, and they tend to be. They went after Microsoft, they went after big telecom, and they'll be the ones that go after big tech. Just because it's an American-based companies, and the Americans may not want to regulate, but they'll let the EU do their dirty work for them.
Well, that has happened in the past. If you're not a national champion, and you're playing an away game, you sometimes have more exposure than you otherwise would. And in general, although it's hard to be specific, but in general, the Europeans regulate more than the Americans do. And they may come at it from a competition law point of view. They may come at it from a privacy point of view, or look at all the personal data that these companies have and how they monetize it. So yeah, I mean, one shouldn't be surprised if that's the result where the Europeans regulate before the Americans do on some of these issues.
As you know, in the old days, a lot of what's going on was related to the FCC and broadcasting and, arguments about, one of the folks that I have coming on to our thing was talking about the fact that, this is unlicensed broadcasting, essentially what you've created with Facebook and Twitter and a lot of these, where essentially you can broadcast whether it's factual or not factual. And it used to be that you had to have a license to do this, and you had to have fact checking, right. And you had to, and that somehow went all out the door a few years ago, and you could just publish anything you wanted. And so do you think there'll be the publishing media sort of regulators stepping in as well? What's your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. Again, that's the part when I was saying there's going to be some kind of regulation and government intervention. We just don't know how. Is it going to be structural separation? Is it going to be enforcement of certain rules? But something is going to happen. And, a lot of people are critical and saying that the government hasn't acted quickly. But I just wanted to remind people that in every previous cycle, going back 100, 150 years, it usually takes the government a couple of decades, not a couple of years, to catch up with the technology. And so that's what you're going to see. We are toward the end of that window. So, you should expect something to happen in the next 5 years. There's been a lot of discussions about free speech and how is it going to be impacted. I don't necessarily see that being impacted as much as people believe. But I do believe that there will be some rules, some regulations. Again, our system works really well when there are known guideposts in terms of, how can you operate. If you play a game, every game has its rules. Usually it doesn't work well when you don't have rules. And so rules are being defined, and it's a normal process. I'm not negative as a lot of people are. I just believe that it's a normal process. People will define rules, and people who are in those industries, if you're working in one of those companies, you should expect some new rules. And it's just the way the world works.